Welcome back to the news today. 5 years have passed since a wave of popular uprisings erupted throughout the Middle East and North Africa, leading to a massive change in the regional political and security landscape. The cradle of what would become known as the Arab Spring was Tunisia, where a young fruit vendor named Mohamed Bouazizi set himself on fire in an act of defiance that in turn ignited the hearts and minds of entire populations. Shai Ben-Ari examines the impact of a once-in-a-generation event.
Next week will mark 5 years since the beginning of the Arab Spring, when mass anti-government protests in Tunisia set off a chain reaction that few could have predicted. The departure of former Tunisian President Zine El Abidine Ben Ali in January of 2011 sparked a domino effect that spread rapidly, shaking the Arab world to its core. The Obama administration and many others in the West placed themselves firmly behind the protesters.
The message that we've sent even before the demonstrations in Egypt has been to friend and foe alike that the world is changing, that you have a young, vibrant generation within the Middle East that is looking for greater opportunity, and that if you are governing these countries, you've got to get out ahead of change. You can't be behind the curve.
The wave of protests toppled dictators and even triggered a civil war. But 5 years later, it would be difficult to say that the hopeful promise was fulfilled. War still rages in Syria, where over 250,000 have lost their lives. Egypt has reverted back to a form of military dictatorship, remarkably similar to the regime of former President Hosni Mubarak, who was deposed at the optimistic height of the 2011 protests. Meanwhile, the crumbling of Arab nation-states with colonial foundations in Syria, Libya, and Iraq has led to power vacuums and a return to a more tribal sense of national identity. This has led to the emergence of darker forces, which have exploited the chaos, made territorial gains, and now pose a major threat to the region and the world at large. The events of the Arab Spring have had far-reaching consequences, even in the West, where in recent weeks Islamic State terror has led to extreme rhetoric from a leading U.S. presidential candidate.
It's going to get worse and worse. You're going to have more World Trade Centers. It's going to get worse and worse, folks. We can be politically correct and we can be stupid, but it's going to get worse and worse.
In France, the far-right Front National party has achieved unprecedented results in regional elections on the backdrop of the Paris terror attacks last month, as well as a major migration wave into Europe. The voices of Arab youths heard around the world during the protests 5 years ago have perhaps been drowned out by that which came after. But many would say this does not diminish their righteous struggle.
Yes, and joining me in the studio to continue the discussion are Dr. Amichai Magen, Senior Lecturer at Lauder School of Government at IDC. Good evening.
Good evening.
Professor Thomas Riese, International Relations Expert at the Free University of Berlin. Good evening.
Good evening.
And Professor Tanya Borzel, EU Foreign Policy Expert, also at the Free University of Berlin. Good evening to you as well. Well, Dr. Magen, let's begin by looking at the bigger picture before we delve into the country specifically. 5 years ago, a huge sense of euphoria.
Absolutely.
People were saying democracy is finally coming to the Arab world, tyranny is over. Looking back now at these countries that have fallen apart to a great extent, what did we miss? What did we not see coming?
Well, I think if we look back five years ago, the big question that everybody was trying to ask themselves was what kind of governments, what kind of state governments will emerge in North Africa and the Middle East and in the aftermath of these protests? Are they going to be democratic and modern and liberal as we've hoped, or are they going to be ruled by Islamists? But if we fast forward 5 years, I think the big question that is defining the Middle East today is not so much what kind of governments will emerge in the Middle East, but how much government, or rather how little effective government is emerging in the Middle East. And I think people missed that. The big debate was this going to be a positive Arab Spring, or is this going to be an Islamist winter? But what has turned out to be a deeper, more transformative process is, as you rightly say, this disintegration of places like Iraq and Syria and Libya, Yemen, and we can continue the list. The list goes on and on. So I think that's really the big the big, deep story that we've missed until pretty recently.
And it's making the story even more impossible to predict. Professor Borzel, would you say that we are past the generation where, or the time where huge changes can come to the Arab world? Is it over, or will we see more dramatic changes like this in other countries?
Question is, what kind of dramatic changes are you expecting? If you think about democratic change, I think that's what was the hope the Arab Spring would bring to these countries. I'm very skeptical in terms of other transformations, the ones Dr. Magen already referred to, in terms of, countries falling apart, being unstable, being written by civil war. I think we're likely to see more of that.
Well, Professor Professor Borzel just made the point about democracy. If we go back before the Arab Spring, 2003 and the U.S. invasion of Iraq, has that taught us that maybe democracy cannot be imposed with military means?
That's a very complex question, but before I answer your question, I'd say not all is lost. I mean, you started this show with the events in Tunisia. And I think of all the countries that went through the situation, I still have some hope left for Tunisia. I think the population, but also the elites, have shown to be really resilient, even in the face of terrorist attacks. So now coming back to your question, no, you cannot impose democracy from... Actually, I would say you cannot impose democracy from the outside, period. What you can do is help. And military intervention is a big step. And we can discuss now the Iraq invasion, etc. That had a really large footprint. And in a way, it also destroyed the Iraqi state, or what was left of it. So a lot of the stuff that Dr. Magen just talked about is exactly about that problem.
Yes, and I want us to elaborate more on countries that do need or could need military intervention. And we're joined now on the phone by Nisma Al-Uzebi, a human rights activist in Yemen. Nisma, can you tell us, in Yemen there is a civil war going on right now. Can we expect that Yemen will see the same fate as Syria, or is there still hope? Nisma, are you with us? Yes, we seem to be experiencing some technical difficulty. We will try to get Nisma back on the phone. Professor Magen, what's your take on Yemen? The war is ravaging the country. Is it headed for the same fate as Syria?
Well, Yemen has been a very fragile place for a long time. And in Yemen, we see many of the characteristics that we see in places like Syria, like Iraq, like Libya. You have sectarian violence, which is ongoing. You have parts of the country which are ruled by a sort of a coherent government are actually very, very limited. It's limited to Sana'a, etc., and Aden to some degree. And even more destabilizing is the fact that you have external actors like Iran supporting some groups, the Houthis, while the Saudis and the Qataris are supporting the Sunnis and Sunni militias. So you don't only have this internal civil war, and of course you have a large Al-Qaeda presence. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula really has a very strong foothold in Yemen. But it's not only an internal issue within Yemen. All this weakness and the contending factions. You have external actors who view Yemen basically as a playground for Shia-Sunni tensions and war. And so that doesn't portend well for stability in Yemen going forward.
Yes, I want to try to get back to Nisma Al-Uzebi in Yemen. Nisma, are you with us now?
Yes, I'm with you now.
Yes, good to have you with us. Dr. Magen was just making the point about the civil war going on in Yemen. How do you see, as a human rights activist, the situation there? Do you still see hope for the country, or is it, like many analysts say, headed for the same fate as Syria?
Well, we do hope for the best for now, but unfortunately, if the situation is still in the same rhythm, for now, I think we will have the same model of Syria coming, because unfortunately we have found that Yemeni leaders are only working for their own interests. They do not care. So they do not care for their people as much. They do care for their own interests and for the countries that they are supported by.
And Nisma, how has human rights violations or the situation of human rights in Yemen, how has that deteriorated in the past 5 years from your experience there in Aden?
From my experience, human rights are now going down and down. Eventually, there is not a single right. Every right of human rights has been violated, either by Houthi militia, by the Saudi bombing, by the former President Ali Abdullah Saleh. Every right you can imagine has been violated. The right of living, the right of education, the right of being safe. Every right you can imagine has been violated in the past 5 years due to the revolution and now due to the current civil war.
Yes, Nisma Al-Azabi joining us from Yemen. Thank you very much for that. Professor Risa, we just heard Nisma Al-Azabi saying that she does feel like Yemen is headed for the same fate as Syria. In this respect, the case of Jordan is also very interesting. It seems that it has skipped the fate of the Arab Spring to a great extent. Would you agree? And if so, why? What signals out Jordan?
I mean, one interesting fact is that most of the Arab monarchies haven't faced any kind of uprising. Yeah, that's kind of curious to me because, of course, these are also autocratic regimes, but apparently, and I'm not an expert on Jordan, but apparently Jordan was able to at least provide some basic services to people, and wasn't that, how should I put it, thoroughly corrupt as some of the other more presidential autocracies that then toppled.
Professor Borzel, would you agree? And if so, what do you think are the major concerns for the future of the Middle East now, 5 years after the Arab Spring?
Okay, there's a two-part question. I think, just to echo what Professor Risa said, I think we have Morocco and Jordan as the two liberalizing monarchies that managed to sort of escape the pathway that erupted from the Arab Spring by, I think, slowly but surely lifting the pressure and letting out some steam by modest reforms. And I think the legitimacy of the monarch certainly plays a role here. In terms of the challenges, I think, again, as Professor Risa already said, I think the key challenge is to provide governance to people, not only in terms of prosperity, but also in terms, as Nisma said, in terms of human rights. But we're not even talking democracy here. We're talking a kind of a context in which people are secure, are not threatened by human rights violations, and are capable of making a life without being threatened to lose their homes. And I think this is modest. So we should maybe not so much focus on hopes for democracy, but rather on providing governance in these areas. And that's also something where external actors then come to help. For instance, the European Union that has done a lot to support countries like Tunisia in rebuilding the economy, rebuilding society.
Well, I want to take your metaphor of the volcano and join to our conversation from Syria, maybe the best metaphor for that. Dr. Kamal Al-Abwani, member of the Syrian opposition. Dr. Al-Abwani, thank you for being with us tonight. Now, we know that the role of the Syrian opposition in the process of Syria is extremely important. Not a lot of people understand what the role of the Syrian opposition is. Do you believe the opposition's goals in Syria are achievable?
I think what happened in Riyadh or the international efforts is not enough. So they use the fake representation and some symbols and say they represent the people of Syria. The people of Syria now under siege and out of Syria, so no any political institute can represent them. That's why I think they will fail to give orders to the fighters or to the people. So the solution is not define the problem as it, because they don't know that the main problem is the regime. The regime used violence against the people, and he tried to make a modernization in artificial way, in violent way. That's why everybody go out and struggle to knock down the regimes, because the regimes like prisons. So if we do not looking for the real need of the people, we cannot find solution. The real need for people is not only the democracy. It need to rebuild the economy, to rebuild the society, to renew the culture. And all of this is not in the mind of who is working now to solve the problems. The problem in Syria defined as a kind of security problem, not kind of chaos that happened because the globalization now is enter the Middle East, as you see, as the Arab Spring.
And Dr. Al-Abwani, I want to pick up on your previous point about President Bashar al-Assad. Unlike other countries, the president has not fallen in Syria. He has not been toppled. Some say if Tunisia is the greatest example of the success of the Arab Spring, well, then Syria is the example of its failure. What's your take on that?
The problem with al-Assad is not political to solve by negotiation. Now we have to face a criminal problem happened because the regime used violence against the people, destroys the cities, kill nearly 500,000 of people. That's the problem now. The problem is must go to justice. We cannot jump to peace without justice. That's the problem in Syria. It is not as Tunisia or as Egypt. We try for a long time to make reform from inside the regime, and he refused, and he cannot. He cannot because he commit a lot of crimes against the people. He stole the money. That's why it must be useless to use Bashar Assad again. Bashar Assad now is a criminal man, and we cannot put our hand with him.
Yes. Dr. Al-Abwani joining us from Stockholm in Sweden. Thank you very much. Dr. McGinn, we just heard what Dr. Al-Abwani said about Bashar al-Assad. Let's take it back to Israel focus. Israel has received a lot of criticism for steering clear of the Arab Spring. A lot of people are debating what the country's motives really are. What can we say now, 5 years later, about Israel?
Well, that Israel got it right, and most other countries, the United States, Europe, and to some degree Turkey, they got it wrong. Israel was blamed for being pessimistic, for concluding rather early on, already in 2011, that we were not going to see this flowering of Jeffersonian democracy in North Africa and the Middle East, and that we're going to experience a lot of turbulence and a lot of uncertainty. And I think that on the whole, Israel read the map more accurately than most. Israel's response to this storm happening around it has basically been one of defensive realism. Israel is trying to protect its economy, its people from this earthquake that is going on around us. If Israel can be faulted in some respect, is perhaps not having the courage to try to use the period of political fluidity to try to influence its neighbors in a more positive way. But Israel doesn't view itself as an actor that can really transform the Middle East, unlike the United States, and we've seen where that landed us in. So I think that on the whole, Israel read the situation more accurately. If I may say something about Syria, the problem we have in the Middle East is that we don't have a choice in Syria between angels and monsters. We have a choice between different kinds of monsters. And as much sympathy as I have for the moderate Syrian opposition, if Assad were to go tomorrow, who will fill in the vacuum? I think part of the big problem is that within the Sunni Arab community, which makes up 75% of the population of Syria, we don't have a liberal, reform-minded leadership that can put the country together again. Maybe we had it 4 or 5 years ago, but at this stage we certainly don't, and that makes things very, very difficult.
Well, let's talk about another neighbor of Israel, a peaceful neighbor of Israel, Egypt. Egypt. So after Mubarak was ousted, of course, the Muslim Brotherhood shortly took power, and now el-Sisi has taken power. A lot of people are saying this has just replicated the regime from before Mubarak's ousting. It begs the question, is a free political democratic process possible in Egypt, Professor Risset?
In the long run, yes. In the short run, no. That's a short answer. The somewhat more complex answer is that what became very clear during the uprising against Mubarak was that the liberal elites in Egypt were way too weak and way too disorganized to be able to put up a viable alternative and democratic alternative. As a result, the Muslim Brotherhood took over. That, to some extent, was completely unused to govern. And the result is where we are now. You know, what I think, though, is that these kind of repressive regimes are not going to be very stable in the mid and long term. So it saves you some time, maybe, but in the middle and long term, there need to be some serious political reforms in Egypt.
Well, let's join into this conversation. From Egypt, Jacob Wertschafer, our I-24 News Cairo contributor. Jacob, thank you for being with us tonight. You just heard what Professor Risset said about Egypt. What do you think about the stance of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt today?
Look, I think we're all looking at the Nobel Peace Prize for the folks from Tunisia here and wondering why it is that they're acknowledged and what their successes were and how that worked. And the key piece is that you had a sophisticated group running the political Islamic party. You had an Islamicist party that had a certain French savoir-faire. And you also, speaking of the liberal elites, you had liberal elites who went back and forth between Tunisia and France. And you had a decolonization situation in Tunisia that was way less strident and painful and divisive than the one that Egypt is really still coping with in some ways. So look, the security state here dominates. We do not have the strong civil society that Tunisia has with its independent trade unions. And the youth society and culture that emerged here in Tahrir but didn't really have a deep social penetration has a different place in Tunisian society. That said, look, I mean, Tunisia is drifting in the Egypt direction. The security forces are prevailing in a struggle. You've got that country sending the most number of foreign fighters to Syria. And so there's a coalescence around the old guard coming back into power in Tunisia and folks being detained in ways that resemble the security regime you see here in Egypt.
Yes, Jacob Wertschafer joining us from Cairo. Thank you very much. You are more than welcome to continue hearing what Professor Borzel will say right now. Professor Borzel, specifically thinking of Egypt and looking at the situation there, it seems that one of the possible conclusions is change of leadership is not always the answer, even though the new leadership is seemingly more open and more democratic. What do you have to say on that?
You're absolutely right. That's exactly one of the major lessons we can not only learn from the Arab Spring, but also from other countries in the post-Soviet space, for instance, where you had a transition and then most of these countries got stuck, right, and morphed into something rather stable, semi-authoritarian. And I think that's what is currently happening in Egypt. And I'm a little bit more optimistic about Tunisia, precisely for the reasons, because there you have the social conditions that are necessary to sustain a regime change towards, transforming a society and a political system into a working democracy. And I think it will depend a lot on the capability of the current government, again, to provide basic public services. Because I think one of the major threats of the militarist Islamists is not only the violence, but also their capacity to provide basic social services in some areas where the state is no longer or has never been capable of providing social services. And that's a challenge that is very often underestimated. I think that's also a chance for actors like the European Union, the US, or even Israel to help these countries, like the governments in Tunisia, to provide these services to the population and bolster their legitimacy.
And that's exactly the point I want to continue with you, Professor Risa. How important is Western involvement in this respect in strengthening liberal regimes in countries such as Tunisia, and what specifically can they do?
First of all, I think they can help, but they cannot determine the situation. Basically, if you have the local conditions in place, if you have some liberal groups like exactly what you currently have in Tunisia, then you can help from the outside, you can strengthen them. Both the EU and the US and other Western powers have resources to help there. But we have to see that, we have very strong limits also in terms of what we can actually do from the outside. You can help some people, aid some people, strengthen liberal forces, but you cannot from the outside make a country democratic if nobody's there who wants to become a democrat.
Yes, I want to go back to Tunisia, the outset of the Arab Spring. Joining us from Jebra is Rafram Haddad, a visual artist. Mr. Haddad, thank you for being with us. Now, a lot has been said tonight about the liberal forces in Tunisia, how badly they need support. Would you agree that this is specifically and truly the case in Tunisia? Is it a model for the Arab Spring in your view?
I think Tunisia is also very different from other countries because there's a big structure of liberals and in the culture scene, lawyers and everything, people who got the Nobel Prize today. And it's like the infrastructure is very solid here. It's not like other countries, other Arab countries.
Yes, how would you say it differs from other Arab countries, Mr. Haddad?
It's all about, I mean, what was in the past here. I mean, as I said, I mean, there's a big group of people here, like probably the majority that want this kind of like we can say democracy or something like that. But I'm a bit confused because. Countries are quite different. I mean, we can say the Arab countries, but every country is different. And in Tunisia, you have a big structure of middle-class people who have other desires. I mean, they are mostly secular country, which is not really always connected. But in this story, it's very connected because they are mostly secular, and they want other things for the country.
Yes. Rafram Haddad joining us from Jerba. Thank you very much. Dr. McGinn, we have 1 minute. It's a big challenge. Last words on the Arab Spring 5 years later.
My goodness. So, you know, the famous saying that I think somebody was asked what he thinks about, you know, the repercussions of the French Revolution are, and the answer was it's too early to say. So the short answer is it's too early to say. I think with that in mind, this is a deep historical process, a transformative process. The Middle East and North Africa that will emerge from this situation is going to be different from the one we had on the eve of December 2010.
Yes, thank you very much, everyone, for joining me tonight. This was an enlightening talk. Lucia Harish will be back here on Sunday for the News Today. Do join us then. Until then, have a good weekend from everyone at the News Today.